But I think it is also true that there are cases where peace is established sustainably without prosecuting those who have committed violence in the lead-up to that peace. It is also a fact that the insistence on criminal justice can, theoretically, derail peace processes. In Uganda, we've seen the unfortunate spectacle of the chief prosecutor himself consistently trying to undermine the peace process. Even yesterday, he declared or it was the day before yesterday, but it was in the paper yesterday, declaring that Con has no interest in peace at all, thus shutting off the possibility for further peace processes and giving the upper hand to those who call for a, quote, military solution. But the admission of the possibility that immediate criminal justice might close off peace processes seems to have been systematically silenced and denied here at this conference. Those bringing it up are accused of being apologists for dictators, or are accused of trying to ensure their own impunity for international crimes. My argument is simply that the impact of criminal prosecutions, including those of the ICC, upon peace is dependent upon the political context in which those proceedings take place. Which is not to say that political context cannot change. Rejecting criminal prosecutions now because they would be damaging to peace does not mean rejecting them later. When the political context has changed, and prosecutions can be part of a politically constructive process. Indeed, even amnesties can be revoked when the political context changes. So I think the formula justice delayed is justice denied sounds nice, but it's wrong. And if pursued in certain cases, can itself end up denying justice. So what about the moral claim that there should be no peace without justice? Based upon the idea that criminal justice is what the victims demand, and that the ICC responds to the victims fulfilling victims' rights. Well, how do we know what victims demand? In many cases, obviously through quantitative or qualitative studies, and in many cases, these quantitative or qualitative studies have incontestably demonstrated that victims do demand criminal prosecutions, and that victims do welcome the ICC. Absolutely. But it is also incontestable that in some cases, especially in the midst of ongoing conflict, people are not in favor of criminal prosecutions, and for a whole host of reasons, may not be in favor of ICC intervention. So by taking what the victims say seriously, and not simply assuming that everyone will or support justice and the ICC, it is apparent that in every situation of conflict, there are some people who demand criminal justice, there are others that don't. There are some who demand different kinds of justice. There are others who would rather not get involved. There's who certainly demands the law of Moses, an eye for an eye. There are political debates on justice and peace within every society. And those debates may take the form of being framed in national legal terms, in international legal terms, in traditional legal terms. There are different concepts of justice between men and women, between the youth and the old, between rebels and government supporters. It's this internal debate within conflict-afflicted societies that the ICC rejects. It tends to see people as helpless, voiceless victims, sees the community as uniformly victimized and voiceless, and thus sees itself as representing the true interests of the victims, even if the real live victims reject the ICC. So when the ICC intervenes, I think we need to see it not as a non-political gesture of solidarity with voiceless victims, but rather as a political act, as a political intervention into a community in significant upheaval. A political act that aligns with or refutes the interests of different political and social forces and actors on the local, national, and international levels. Therefore, I think the ICC needs to be responsible for the political effects of its interventions, a responsibility that it cannot dodge or avoid by invoking the mantra of no peace without justice or invoking the abstract figure of the voiceless victim. ICC interventions, in this sense, need to be assessed against their political consequences. Are they helping to bring about sustainable political changes? Are they establishing impunity for certain groups? Will ICC interventions strengthen the violent or be used for anti-democratic agendas? Will it raise the hopes of marginalized groups, only to leave them even more vulnerable when the ICC intervention ends? Or will or leave these groups the targets of a backlash the ICC is incapable of protecting them from. In short, and I think this is the key question we need to ask of ICC interventions, are ICC interventions helping to build sustainable, peaceful, just, and inclusive political communities? So, my third point, what happens when the ICC monopolizes justice and crowds out other conceptions of justice? Well, the ICC is quickly establishing a monopoly for international criminal justice as the primary form that global justice takes. In so monopolizing the discourse of global justice, especially in Africa, the ICC has effectively restricted those issues that can be addressed and those actors who can be held accountable in the name of justice. It has placed certain problems and issues and actors outside the scope of what can be defined as unjust and thus subject to challenge and contestation through the pursuit of global justice. Now, I think we can see this, for example, in terms of the ICC's subject matter jurisdiction. The forms of violence, repression, and inequality that can be challenged as unjust are restricted to the most spectacular forms of overt violence. Less spectacular but equally deadly forms of violence and repression, economic exploitation, Western sponsorship of violent and anti-democratic regimes, internationally enforced disparities in access to medicines, trade regimes that undermine development and food security, violence against women that takes place during so-called peacetime. None of these can be challenged through the pursuit of global justice when global justice is defined by the ICC. Global justice becomes exclusively associated with punishing the, quote, most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, conceived of as mass atrocities, while those crimes that serve the interests of the international community are conveniently outside the ICC's scope. Personal jurisdiction under the ICC is similarly restricted, focusing as it does on placing the entire blame on a few individuals, while often reductively representing situations and reducing the wide set of actors and structures involved in violence to one or two people. By focusing on those with greatest responsibility, who thus far have always happened to be Africans, the ICC ignores the criminal responsibility of Western states, donors, aid agencies, and corporations, the invisible actors that were talked about in the symposium last week, even in those episodes of violent atrocity that the court is willing to investigate. And finally, of course, the ICC's limited temporal jurisdiction includes not only things that happened in the 1990s, but centuries of injustice, of Western violence here in Africa. Now, if the ICC were conceived as simply a technical mechanism for use in specific circumstances, this would be less of a problem. The problem, as I mentioned, results from what has become the ICC's monopolization of the language of global justice. The irony, I think, is that the idea of global justice is uniquely capable of challenging these forms of international violence and oppression and Western domination. And so the ICC ends up impoverishing what should be a radically emancipatory language of global justice. I think this discussion also leads us to question the distinction between so-called global and so-called local justice. The justice of the ICC can be very partial, parochial, or politicized. The justice demanded by supposedly local African victims may itself be truly global, going far beyond the narrow limits imposed by the ICC. So, to conclude, I don't know if these problems, or I ask if these problems, the ICC's counterproductive accommodation to power, its refusal of political accountability, and its impoverishment of the concept of global justice, if these can be dealt with through reform of the ICC. One solution might be to scale down the hyperbolic claims that are made on behalf of the ICC, that it will end impunity universally, that it will usher in peace, that it represents global justice for all victims. I think we need to be clear about the limitations of the ICC, and perhaps all we should expect is that it enforce international law where it can. Can we come up with strategies to make the ICC more responsible? Would the formulation of the crime of aggression lead in that direction? Or perhaps alternative forms of justice need to be articulated and developed that are more accountable to the people, and that perhaps an unintended benefit of ICC interventions is to catalyze precisely this process. So, thank you very much.